Good afternoon, everybody. It is Russ the Gridiron Piper, and I just got home from work and took a quick nap. Got my VA glasses on. These things are absolutely hideous. That's why I like them. You know, it's funny because I used to wear, I'd get issued glasses when I was in the service all the time, and I would always pick the ugliest ones. I actually thought the BCGs that you get in basic training were really cool. My wife is a little annoyed that I always pick glasses like these, but whatever, man. Functionality over aesthetics sometime. But I wanted to share with you because I was at the record store today. I still buy CDs every now and then. I'm trying to kind of rebuild my CD collection to resemble sort of what it did when I was in high school and college. Of course, admittedly, I've listened to a lot of the bands that I used to think were really good. And when I listen to them, I'm like, man, this is terrible. Not all of them, some of them. But there's definitely staples in my music catalog. And I just want my CD catalog my CD collection to sort of have these staples in it. You know, I spent probably the last year or so getting a vinyl player, cassette deck, a CD deck, an amplifier, and like these old school speakers. So I like to put the CDs in there and enjoy the nostalgia. But in any case, I was looking for the CD of a band called Nile. And they're a death metal band. They have a very Egyptian theme. They've been around for a long time. I listened to them when I was a lot younger. You know, a genre like death metal, even to the connoisseur, there's a point where things start to sound the same, you know. And that's with any music. I grew up, my dad listened to a lot of jazz and fusion. You know, I couldn't tell who's who, you know, unless somebody has a very distinct sort of guitar playing style. But it's the same thing with death metal. So Nile is a breath of fresh air because they play in these more exotic guitar modes, and they have a lot of Egyptian themes to their lyrical content and their music, the sound. So anyways, I was looking for their latest album. So I swing in there and I browse through the CDs, and I find the CD that I talked about at length on a previous video discussing music, and it was the album by a band called In Flames. It's one of my favorite albums. It's one of the best, I'd say, Gothenburg Swedish death metal albums ever recorded. That is In Flames, Reroute to Remain. And when I talk about this album, I talk about the subtitle underneath the In Flames, where it says 14 songs of conscious insanity. And this album played a very big role in the evolution of my musical taste. Before this, the heaviest stuff that I listened to was probably Metallica. Maybe some metalcore, like very early Avenged Sevenfold. When I saw this album cover with that subtitle, I was like, I don't know if I'm ready for this, man. And I ended up going back and buying it, and of course I was floored. The one that I bought instead of this was another album by In Flames called Soundtrack to Your Escape. Now that album was my first introduction to In Flames, okay? In Flames has a lot of albums, and In Flames is a band where their early work has a very dedicated cult following, me included. My path, however, introduced me to later In Flames, only to discover earlier In Flames work. So I like all of it, up until, some of I don't want to get into the weeds here, but what I'm trying to say is I really have a special place for Soundtrack to Your Escape, and it's unfortunately an album that a lot of the cult following despise because they view it as sort of like a lot of Metallica fans view the Black Album. They're like, yeah, it's a decent album, but it signifies sort of the beginning of the end, you know. But yeah, so if you're interested, man, these guys have been around for 30 years, man. They got a massive catalog, and they've gone through some lineup changes, but these guys in the heavy metal, if you were to talk about heavy metal and if you were to talk about death metal, what are the bands that you can't go without mentioning? Like obviously Black Sabbath, heavy metal, Metallica, right? What are these types of bands whose Iron Maiden, who had just this indelible long-term impact on the genre, on music, to where the entire scene or maybe the standards of that genre shifted. And I don't think you can have that conversation without mentioning In Flames. I do think you can have that conversation without mentioning Nile. They're just a really good death metal band. But there's nothing earth-shattering there. We're not talking about like the band called Death, Chuck Schuldiner. These people that sort of opened up Pandora's box. And I definitely think In Flames is one of those bands. But anyways, get a wild hair up your ass. It's definitely a good listen. Well, that's all I really have to talk about today. So I appreciate you stopping by, and see you guys on the high ground.